family values, community standards, basic beliefs. We hear about and use these phrases freely in discussion of political, economic, and social issues. But how are they defined? And among a wide-ranging set of values and beliefs, which are most important to us? And which should be of critical concern to those making decisions and policies affecting our present and future well-being? Now, thanks to a new, thoughtful, and probing study of values and beliefs among Oregonians, we begin to have some of the answers. This study, sponsored by the Oregon Business Council, tested the values and beliefs of more than 1,300 Oregonians in every region of the state. It produced a document that the Oregonian called a roadmap into the future for state policymakers. Moreover, the study has produced data that provides a clearer picture about some of the changes Oregonians are willing to make to improve education and other public service systems in the state. To give us an overview of the study results, Bill Wyatt, the president of the Oregon Business Council, is with us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome Bill to the podium. As many of you know, Bill is an active member of the City Club and a former member of the Board of Governors of the club. Bill became president of the Oregon Business Council in 1987. The council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of Oregon business executives dedicated to developing sound public policy. Its current agenda items include helping to implement education reform in Oregon, creating a balance in Oregon's tax system, reducing the demand for illegal drugs in Oregon, and most recently taking on a look at the future role of the forest products industry in Oregon. Bill is a native Oregonian who attended Willamette University and the University of Oregon, and in his early career days represented District 2 in Northwest Oregon as a member of the Oregon State House of Representatives. Prior to becoming president of the council, Bill served as executive director of the Association for Portland Progress, Portland's downtown development association. Previously, he was the City of Portland's lobbyist at the state legislature and director of government relations for the Oregon State Employees Association. Bill is a senior fellow and president of the American Leadership Forum. He has served as chair of the board of the Urban League of Portland and is currently vice chair of Oregon Public Broadcasting. Will you join me in welcoming Bill Wyatt?
Don, thank you very much. It should be noted that I was the City of Portland's lobbyist following in the good footsteps of your president-elect, Don Barney, who taught me many of the tricks of that particular trade. Thank you very much for having me today, and I want to commend the club for this series, Oregon at Risk. It's not only appropriate in my view, but it's very timely, as we can see by watching the daily events in Salem. I'm particularly pleased to be a part of this series with my good friend David Frohnmeyer, who was here last week, and I must say, while I was not able to be here, I did listen to the tape and want to commend you all for the stirring rendition of Happy Birthday that was rendered to him prior to his speech. My task this afternoon is to speak with you about the Oregon Values and Beliefs Study commissioned by the Oregon Business Council, and in particular those values and beliefs of Oregonians which relate to education, which is at the heart of this Oregon at Risk series. Before beginning, I'd like to offer a couple of admonitions. This is a presentation, perhaps some of you have seen it before, that I normally do with the considerable aid of computer-aided graphics that run through an overhead projector. Needless to say, particularly for those in the radio listening audience, that's not a terribly effective technique. And with the time available, we're really prevented from pursuing that. What that means is that statistics numbers will play a fairly significant part in my discussion today. And if at times that seems a bit overdone, I seek your indulgence. Furthermore, this will be by no means a complete rendition of the findings of the Oregon Values and Beliefs study. Rather, as the theme of this program, this series suggests, it will focus primarily on the topic of education. If you wish to pursue other topics during the question period, feel free to do so. The value study was born out of a sense of frustration and concern shared by many of my directors. I've subsequently come to know shared by many people about their collective lack of comfort in knowing those things that were truly important to Oregonians. Oregon has undergone enormous change in the last decade, and while we seem to understand much about these changes, we know considerably less about the effect of these changes on the values and the beliefs of Oregonians. When this study was first conceived, the Oregon Progress Board and the benchmarks were relatively new to the scene, flowing as they did from Oregon Shines, our strategic planning document. The benchmarks are a very hopeful sign for Oregon, in my view. Not only should we plan for our future, but we should set measurable goals as well, a notion that is well known and certainly accepted in the business world. Yet underneath the positive feelings about this kind of progressive and thoughtful planning lingered a concern about the true nature of the down, deep, irreducible core values of Oregonians, a subject of considerable importance in a state with such a long tenured history of citizen involvement and governance. Within this context, then, the OBC set out to design and implement the Oregon Values and Beliefs Study. Our principal objectives were to explore the underlying core values of Oregonians, to gain understanding about those values, where there are differences as well as where there are similarities, to examine key public policy issues within the context of those values, and to provide a benchmark against which to measure future change. The Council employed Decision Sciences of Portland, whose president, Adam Davis, personally supervised the execution of this study. In fact, the Oregon Values and Belief Studies is two studies in one. One of them has the look and the feel of a conventional, closed, and open-ended opinion survey evaluating issues of broad significance to Oregonians. In this portion of the survey, we examined issues like the environment, race relations, education, issues of regional division in Oregon, the characteristics of those who are important in our personal lives. We sought opinions about various communities in Oregon and the Northwest, where people get their information from. We asked about health care and the arts, and in particular, we caused people to focus on the present and then on the future, a distinction which provides some of the most compelling findings from this portion of the study. The second study involves a technique pioneered by Graves Research of Redlands, California, whose founder, Peter Graves, interestingly enough, is an Oregonian by birth. This technique, called scaled comparisons, is more commonly referred to as trade-off analysis, and it follows and it allows for the measurement of abstract qualities like core values. Those of you who have ever taken a Myers-Briggs type indicator examination will recognize this technique. One feels upon completion as though you've answered the same impossible question 1,000 different times. It was this scaled comparison technique which we employed to measure and rank core values. This was a particularly important piece of the study because of a concern that we and many others had about the willingness of participants to bare their souls, if you will, with respect to their own core and sometimes very personal values. Utilizing this technique essentially means that you can run, but you can't hide, and that was very important to us as we undertook this study. The scaled comparisons technique was used to measure values in 4 separate categories. Personal values, we had a list of 10 values which were measured. Personal activities, a list of 20 activities. We created 2 activities for each of the personal values so that we could see if there was a relationship between activities that people felt important and things they said they valued in their personal life. 24 different government services, and a list of 32 different community values. Examples of personal values are participation in family, or career or job opportunity, or practice of religion and spirituality. Personal activities included such things as spending time with family, or learning new skills for advancement, or attending public meetings. A hot one, to be sure. Government services included such items as fire and emergency services, primary and secondary education, or services for low income. Community values, the fourth category in which we measured core values, include such items as accessible hospitals and health care, community committed to quality education, or respect for community history. In each of these four categories, each of these values was juxtaposed against each of the other values within that same category, and participants were required to indicate a preference on a 5-point scale. For example, one such juxtaposition in the category of personal values would pit participation in family against career or job opportunity on the other side of the page, and then with a 5-point scale in the middle. And the job of the participant is to place a mark on that scale where they feel that it belongs. The fact is that in many cases the mark was right in the middle, indicating a neutral stance. But every once in a while that mark begins to filter from one side to the other, and it is in so doing the means by which we were able then to measure and rank order personal and core values. Each participant filled out several pages worth of scaled comparisons for each value category. Participants in the value study included 1,361 Oregonians, as Don mentioned. We acquired these individuals through the process of random digit dialing. An interesting bit of trivia that I learned along the way about Oregon is that we lead the nation in the number of unlisted phone numbers, which is probably a value in itself. Surveys were administered face-to-face in each of Oregon's 36 counties. Participants were paid $35 apiece to participate, and survey administration took anywhere from 1 to 4 hours. The questionnaire included over 300 separate and individual questions, and so you can imagine the pile of data that results. For the purposes of our study, we divided Oregon into 4 regions and intentionally oversampled in each region so that we could conduct subgroup analysis within each region. For example, one might wish to know the impact of newly arrived residents in the metro area on concerns about growth, for example, population growth, economic growth, et cetera. The demographics of our sample are, fortunately, a near mirror of the 1990 census, so we are quite confident that this indeed reflects the broad and diverse qualities of our state's people. The data was collected during July and August of 1992, and it is our feeling that the extraordinary efforts taken to ensure the integrity of this data gives it a longer than normal shelf life. This is particularly the case with the scaled comparisons of core values, which are much less likely to be affected by day-to-day or even month-to-month changes. If any one person is particularly identified with this project, it is Roger Breesley, the chairman and CEO of U.S. Bancorp, along with Jerry Drummond, who was then CEO of NERCO. He provided the initial inspiration for this study and subsequently chaired the task force which oversaw its execution. When the data was very nearly collected, he asked me to begin thinking about a format for a summary of the study, and I had in mind something that would be in the order of 30 or 40 pages. Executive that he is, he had something in mind that would be in terms of 30 or 40 words. Despite my initial panic at the prospect of summarizing a pile of data tables standing several feet high and costing nearly $300,000 in 30 or 40 words, I can now safely say that just 4 words provide compelling insight into the findings of the Oregon Values and Beliefs Study. Families, employment, education, livability. The entirely unintended acronym created by these 4 words is FEEL. While the symmetry of this may seem a bit cosmic, it nevertheless speaks volumes about what's truly important to Oregonians. Furthermore, these 4 items are inextricably linked to one another. Underlying each of these is the strong sense the powerful and fundamental change is occurring in Oregon. And while not everyone understands the precise nature of these changes, there is evidence that Oregonians are prepared to adapt rather than to merely resist. The results of the scaled comparison portion of the study leave little doubt that families form the core around which Oregonians organize their lives. In the personal values category, participation in family was not just at the top of the list of 10 personal values, but on a scale of 100, its score was 88, followed by career or job opportunity at a distant but nevertheless strong 62, followed then by concern for the environment at 49. On the list of 20 personal activities, now you'll recall that we created 2 activities for each of the preceding values for the sake of correlating. The leading activity was spending time with family with a score of 95, followed by spending time with parents at 70. Pretty interesting because it implies a very strong relationship with that personal value, participation in family. On the list of community values, the 3rd leading item was safe neighborhoods and parks at 86, followed closely by family-oriented community at 79. Furthermore, when asked the open-ended question, which means that participants essentially supplied their own response, if you had 1 extra hour a week, how would you spend it? Well over 20% gave specific family-related responses. An aside, Michael Powell would be pleased to know that the single largest response was reading. Oregonians were less sanguine about the future of the family unit. When asked to react to the statement, over the next 10 years, the family unit will become stronger, 32% disagreed strongly or somewhat, 33% agree strongly or somewhat, and the balance, 33%, were neutral. Employment, jobs, career is a somewhat distant but nevertheless strong second in its importance to Oregonians. Again, on the list of 10 personal values, career or job opportunity was second, scoring 62 on this same scale of 100, followed by item number 3, concern for the environment, at 49. The 3rd leading personal activity was learning new skills for advancement at 68. This, by the way, was on a list of 20 other activities, which suggests the relationship which Oregonians draw between the nature of work and education, and I'll have more to say about this in a moment. Local employment opportunities was 6th on the list of 32 community values with a score of 78 on that same 100-point scale. When asked what is the most important issue facing Oregon today, the largest category of responses came in the area of employment and the economy. When asked what do you think will be the most important issue facing Oregon in 10 years, the largest single response again was employment and the economy. When asked if you could fix any one thing about Oregon, what would it be? Employment and the economy was again the leading response. In a portion of the survey we will call the Oregon job performance, 19 items were measured on a 5-point scale from very good to very bad. The question was, overall, how good a job do you think Oregon is doing with the following? The 3 items receiving the least number of very good responses were creating jobs, providing Oregonians the skills necessary to compete in a global economy, and keeping jobs. Participants gave more positive ratings to our ability to control crime and drug use to these 3 items. This with clear evidence, by the way, to the contrary with respect to creating and keeping jobs. Oregon actually has done fairly well at that on the basis of our national ranking. Nevertheless, this provides a very strong indication of the underlying nervousness of Oregonians about their economic security. The principal subject of this City Club series, Oregon at Risk, is education, and it is within this topic area that the Oregon Values and Beliefs Study offers what I believe are some of the most compelling findings about Oregonians. On the scaled comparisons list of 20 items, learning new skills for advancement was a strong 3rd with 68 on a 100-point scale. Now, as a native, as Don indicated, I wonder if this would have been the case a decade ago in Oregon, 15 years, 20 years ago, on this list of 20 items to see something called learning new skills for advancement in 3rd position. The 2nd leading item on the list of 24 government services was primary and secondary education with an 83. Number 3 on that same list was employment and training with a 77. Both of these items preceded such critical public services as police services, drinking water, and sewer services. Higher education, by the way, was in 9th position on that same list with a score of 59. Compelling as well is that out of 32 different community values, community committed to quality education was a very strong 2nd with a score of 86. And I should say at this point that the leading values in each of the scaled comparison categories, the 4 categories that I mentioned to you earlier, were essentially consistent among demographic groups and among regions of the state. So there is a degree of consensus that some might find surprising. The 2nd leading response to the question, what is the most important issue facing Oregon today, behind employment and economy, was education. Equally strong responses followed the questions, what will be the most important issue facing Oregon in 10 years? And if you could fix any one thing about Oregon, what would it be? Education was the second most often mentioned item. Clearly, these findings suggest a very strong bond between Oregonians and their feeling for the importance of education, particularly K through 12. For those of you who I am certain are now wondering how all of this can possibly square with the voters' decision on Measure 5, the property tax limitation adopted in 1990, I'll speak further on this subject in my concluding remarks. In the meantime, let me suggest that it is not necessarily accurate or appropriate to believe that voters make an automatic and direct connection between money and quality education. While I think it is clear that participants reflect the critical importance of education, it is by no means axiomatic that they want more of the same. That is to say, the status quo in education is clearly not perceived to be meeting present needs, much less those of the future. For example, when asked, is major change needed in the public education system, 82% say yes. This is not particularly surprising because it is consistent with similar data on a national level. Indeed, people tend to support most kinds of institutional change in general. You are all no doubt familiar with the dichotomy that exists between people's feelings toward Congress versus their feelings toward their particular representative. We hate Congress, yet we re-elect well over 90% of all incumbents for Congress. This same dichotomy tends to hold true for most other forms of institutional change, which makes all the more interesting the response to the question, is major change needed in your local neighborhood school? 65% of parents of school-age children said yes, while 51% of parents, non-parents I should say, said no. The difference in this case between parents and non-parents I think is fairly obvious and reflected in the results. Non-parents are less familiar with their local neighborhood school and therefore less willing to offer an opinion. The dichotomy between support for change in general versus change in specific clearly breaks down in Oregon on this subject, a fact which clearly distinguishes our views on the need for education change from most other places in the country. It is obviously important that we understand this, so I want to examine the nature of the change which is contemplated and the potential relationship between those changes and the perceived changes in the nature of work today, a relationship which is, in my view, not entirely coincidental. To those who answered yes to the question about major change in local schools, we asked, what kind of change? The single most prominent response was higher standards. The largest category of responses came together under the umbrella of curricular concerns. Many of those responses mentioned things like more math and science, more vocational technical, more academic, less extracurricular, etc. Responses related to funding were a distant second, and responses in this category were about evenly well divided between those who felt we needed more money and those who thought we should use the resources more efficiently. Participants were asked to react to a series of statements from two different perspectives. First, is the statement likely? And second, is the statement desirable? When responding to the statement, education will change to involve more accountability and new classroom practices, participants felt that it was quite a bit more desirable than likely, indicating a degree of skepticism perhaps, but nevertheless, this statement was deemed as both desirable and likely. When responding to the statement, K through 12 education will be fundamentally different, involving new classroom atmospheres and teaching techniques, the reaction was virtually identical, suggesting that there is a core constituency for this line of thinking. In a slightly different twist, participants were asked to respond to the statement, some people say a whole new approach is needed in local neighborhood schools, involving everything from classroom atmospheres to teaching techniques. Others say the need is to do what we're doing now, but to do it better. Which way do you feel? 54% fell on the whole new approach side of that scale, while 30% were on the doing it better side of the scale, with 14% in the middle. Each of these questions, along with others in the study, were designed to elicit from participants their views about change in K through 12 education. a subject of obvious importance in Oregon because of our recent enactment of the Oregon Education Reform Act for the 21st century. We were particularly interested in knowing whether or not people had some idealized notion of education in mind, as in the good old days, or were people focused on something new and different. Well, it may well be that the education reform debate we've had here in Oregon over the last couple of years has actually penetrated the public psyche. It is clearly true that participants in the value study strongly support change. An additional finding of the value study is that Oregonians perceive significant change in the nature of work, and that these changes may well be connected to their feelings about the nature of change in education. When asked to rate Oregon's job performance in providing Oregonians the skills necessary to compete in a global economy, 17% said Oregon was doing a very good or somewhat good job, while 46% thought Oregon was doing a very bad or somewhat bad job, and 29% were neutral. Of the 19 items that we measured using the Oregon job performance, this one received the second least percentage of very good responses, and it ranked 18th on that basis overall. This one I find particularly interesting because I can't help but wonder if the phrase global economy would even have registered a decade ago, another possible indication about the way that Oregonians are experiencing and perceiving change. When confronted with the statement, over the next 10 years, wages for those with a high school education or less will fall in Oregon, 66% agreed strongly or somewhat, and only 14% disagreed. While this may seem obvious, I wonder how obvious it would have seemed 10, 15, 20 years ago in Oregon, a time when family wage jobs were widely available to those with less than a high school diploma, a matter of fact which came to a sudden, stunning conclusion during the decade of the 80s. The statement, over the next 10 years, Oregon employers will produce more sophisticated and valuable products that rely on higher worker education and skill, elicited a strong 61% who agreed, strongly or somewhat, while only 13% disagreed. Over the next 10 years, frontline workers will be asked to take on more and more responsibility in Oregon. Again, 63% agreed strongly or somewhat, while only 3% disagreed, and 28% were neutral. Here then are the conclusions regarding the subject of education, in particular K through 12 education, and the Oregon Values and Belief Study. In the scaled comparison section of the study, point number 1, in the scaled comparison section of the study, and even in every relevant category, education was very near the top-rated value. Education, particularly K through 12 education, is critically important to Oregonians. 2, Oregonians want change in education, both in general and in specific. 3, the nature of the desired change is focused on new techniques, new classroom atmospheres, higher standards, and not on some idealized notion of what education used to be like. 4, Oregonians acknowledge significant changes in the nature of work in Oregon, changes which they also acknowledge will require higher worker education and skill. Now let me try to relate these findings to the topic at hand, Oregon at Risk. Earlier I said that I would address what many see as a conundrum, strong support for education on the one hand and the passage of Measure 5 on the other. It would take much more time than is available today to assess the full extent of reasons for the passage of Measure 5. Nevertheless, it is clear to me that Oregonians do not make a direct and automatic connection between taxes, Measure 5, and quality education. It is also clear, however, that education represents the one clear point of intersection between core values and tax reform, and that Oregonians are prepared to make an investment in quality education. To paraphrase James Carville, it's about education, stupid. And parenthetically, tax reform is not an issue of particular unique interest to most Oregonians. When contemplating this, however, it's important to keep in mind that net personal income has declined in Oregon, owing largely to some of the very issues referenced in the value study. That means that people here spend more of their income for government, including education, than they used to. This suggests that the pre-Measure 5 pot of available resources is unlikely to be filled to the brim, at least not by the voters. A critical eye towards more efficient, less expensive, perhaps even less extensive government will be critical in addressing these issues. And now let me re-paraphrase James Carville. It's about education reform, stupid. Oregonians have been deeply impressed by the significant economic changes which have occurred here in the last decade. In their view, education which is relevant in meeting the challenges of a changing economy, is critical to future economic security. Buying more of the same is probably not going to sell. We must stay the course with the education reform initiatives underway. Losing our momentum would be most unfortunate and would appear to be inconsistent with the true desires of Oregonians. Let me now conclude by emphasizing a point I made earlier. Underlying the assessment of core values in the value study is a strong sense that powerful, fundamental, and rapid change is occurring. We are not merely in the trough of one more economic cycle, but rather a sea change is underway. Despite the considerable nervousness with which Oregonians view this change, evidence exists, strong and I believe hopeful evidence, that Oregonians are prepared to adapt, not merely to resist. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Now it's time for questions. For those of you that have written questions, would you please hold them up, and staff will make sure they get up here to be looked at. First question today will be asked by Andy Wheeler, member of the Board of Governors. Andy?
Thank you. Bill, last Friday, Dave Frummeyer told us that by the turn of the century, only 50% of high school students would be able to afford college. In a knowledge economy, do we all have to go to college?
I think it's probably appropriate for me at this point to say that I may depart a little bit from the empirical data in the study and assert a few of my own views. I'm not sure that I could answer the question otherwise. I did listen to the tape of Dave's discussion last week and was struck by one thing where I think he and I may disagree. If I understood him correctly, what he essentially said about the workforce of the future was that, if I could imply this, that basically we're all headed towards a day when everyone will need to be educated to the level of rocket science. And I dispute that. I just don't think that's accurate. I think that certainly the role of manual labor is decreasing in our world and is decreasing rapidly, and probably few states have experienced that to the extent that Oregon has over the course of the last decade. But the fact remains that we will have an enormous role in our society for people who are educated to some lesser standard than I think the one that Dave said. So my answer to that question is no. My further answer to that question is we have set ourselves on a policy course in Oregon, House Bill 3565, the Education Reform Act, which underscores that very fact, that a traditional four-year postgraduate program is not going to be required for all of Oregon's, all of our country's workers.
Our second question today comes from Donna Acord, the chair of the Standing Committee on Education.
Bill, you mentioned education and employment being linked together closely. What do you think that implies about the leadership role of businesses in ensuring that this change that's needed to provide a viable economy will occur in education?
One of the key features of the Education Reform Act is the so-called school-to-work transition, a transition which we have not well defined yet in Oregon, even with the passage of this measure. And I think it implies that business has a critical role in helping define how this relationship works within the context of this new world that we confront with education reform. And I know that when the measure was enacted by the legislature, the term school-to-work transition was in wide currency. Everybody used it. And there are enormously wide, varying definitions of what that means. There are those who feel that it's a kind of full apprentice program, which it frankly cannot be. We simply don't have room for that scale of activity in Oregon. And there are others who may feel on the opposite end that it amounts to shadowing people around in businesses. And I think it is incumbent upon the business world to first acknowledge that this school-to-work transition is critical, and secondly, I think it's critical that especially the large businesses who now have the resources to begin looking at this issue step up and help design models that will work successfully for the wide range of businesses in Oregon, which for the most part are small businesses.
The floor is now open to members of the club for questions. Please try to make your questions brief and lead as readily as possible to a question mark. The microphone is here in the middle of the floor. The first question?
Ken Duker, City Club member. I'd like to ask a question about the relationship of education and livability. And I'm asking this question in part because I have with me 15 guests from Portland State who are here in town for a short course on urban growth management. And so, raise your hands, please, these guests. And we're here also to seek public discussion and public involvement and action. Thank you.
So, one more time, the question was what?
To discuss the interrelationship of your education and livability factors.
Okay. One of the things that we explored in some detail in the values study was how people felt about Oregon. And it's interesting to note we don't have a lot of comparative data to look at in terms of other states and reactions one might get, but my sense is this: Oregonians have a very powerful attachment to this place. And I'm just speculating now, probably stronger than in many other places around the country. We don't like to leave unless we absolutely have to. And if you look at those areas of the state where people are most likely now to have to confront that, areas where there is severe economic dislocation in the timber communities and so forth, education is a very critical component to people's capacity to either stay or to at least not have to move very far away. And I would say I was pleasantly surprised by the extent of the acknowledgement of that fact. I use this anecdote. I grew up in Astoria, Oregon. Any Astorians here? And many of the kids that I went to high school with could easily leave in their freshman or sophomore years and walk straight into family wage jobs as their parents had before them, either on the river or out in the woods or up in Alaska. And those are kids who are now, if they are from my class, are 43 years old and without skills and frankly without family wage jobs and not much prospect of finding family wage jobs. And it is among these folks that we find a very strong acknowledgement of the role of education. And these are also some of the very folks who resist most strongly leaving their communities. And so there is a kind of a symbiotic relationship there. And it was pretty interesting to see that really fly out of this information.
Thank you. Have another question?
Oh, yeah. My name is Patrick Conley, City Club member, president of Political Action Committee, America First, Politicians Last, and a software entrepreneur, owner of an international software publishing company. First comment, then ask my question. 2 years ago, I ran this ad in quite a few newspapers all over the state, Oregonian, Willamette Week, other places. Education is slavery. I haven't seen any change. Basically, I think that the system is generating a bunch of slaves. I want to quote some FBI statistics.
Could we have the question?
Oh, yeah.
Please?
Yeah. Well, hey, I can state the problem, and then I can ask you the question. FBI statistic 2 years ago that today in our inner city, 75% of the young people of whites and 90% of black males have criminal records. Also, in the next 10 years, 90% of all new jobs will not require high school education. Today, we have an excess of lawyers, engineers, and will not need for this projected future. I got into this 8 years ago because as an entrepreneur having to hire clerical people for my software company and engineers, I quickly realized I couldn't hire engineers in this state because you didn't generate any that could do anything, were willing to work, or that were creative. It's really hard even to hire clerical people. So I've gotten really, really mad over the last 6 years, and then I took it to myself about 3 years ago, this political action committee of mine.
I think we've got the
I
case.
just want
I'd
to
like
ask
to
one
get
thing.
to the question.
What are you going to do to end this sheep? Because I've talked to the entrepreneurs, I've gone to business meetings for 5 years, and all you want to do in these business organizations and all these fronts in Oregon is generate sheep. I want to see entrepreneurs. I want to see young people come out of school willing to start their own business,
And what is
not
the,
sheep.
What is the question then, please?
What are you guys going to do to quit creating all the sheep?
Sheep, Mr. Wyatt.
Sheep it is. I agree, by the way, about the lawyers. I think we've got too many of those. Sorry. I know there are a lot of you out there. A sheep shop, he said. Actually, you know, I think perhaps a bit overstated. I think the speaker comes very close to one of the central features of the education reform debate that we've been having in Oregon for the last couple of years, and that is that the nature of work, the way things have changed here in Oregon and around the country requires an entirely different reaction, an entirely different kind of person, the sort that might well feel comfortable in this fellow's software company. And it's my sense, at least, that that is one of the fundamental underpinnings of the education reform initiative that we have gotten underway. It isn't going to be overnight, I can tell you that. But I think it is at the center of this entire debate, which is that the old assembly line model, which was appropriate for the industrial age, is simply no longer appropriate. People need to be able to react, to respond. The kind of change that I think makes us all nervous is happening with such incredible speed that we need people who are at least more comfortable and more able to respond to that. And it seems to me we are at least at some point in the continuum of responding to that.
Ray?
Ray Polani, a City Club member. I have a question. I think you mentioned that this study is about values and beliefs. And I feel that probably sometime in the next year or so, we will be voting on some substitute funding measures for Measure 5 to fund education, human resources, corrections, you name it. All the things that are in need of replacement funding. On the other hand, the legislature is planning to increase gasoline taxes by some 20% in the next 2 years without a vote of the people. They're planning to increase registration fees some 200% without a vote of the people. What do you think? Is the legislature in tune with Oregon voters' sentiments and values and beliefs, or not? Why are we going to be able to vote on some very crucial issues, and the other one is not perceived to be that important, yet it's perceived to be important enough to warrant such tremendous increases in taxes?
Ray, I'm a little disappointed. I had a transit response all ready to go, but I guess we'll save that. I'm going to maybe leave for someone else the question about whether the legislature is in tune with Oregon values. Voters get to take their crack at that every 2 years. I do think, though, it's an interesting question because the gasoline tax that you referenced is also in specific response to an extraordinary plan that has been developed over the course of many years with broad, widespread participation. It's something in the scheme of something larger. The sales tax, or presumably sales tax that we'll be voting on in the next few months, may not necessarily be that. It is obviously in reaction to something else that has occurred. The other thing I would say about the sales tax is simply this: we've already voted on it 9 times in Oregon, and to now try and enact it without having a vote of the people might seem a bit disingenuous, and for a state with the initiative, referendum, and recall, perhaps even foolish. The gas tax, we've done both ways. We've voted on gas taxes before, and the legislature has enacted them. But I think it's safe to say the legislature is reacting to a very thoughtful, well-designed, in their view, plan, strategic document, if you will, the Oregon Transportation Plan, of which an increase in the gas tax is but one part. And I think that's a pretty important message for us, too, about how to deal with some of these other issues.
The only problem, though, is that the increases that I mentioned are not going to fund the broad-based plan. They're going to continue to fund more highways extension. The rest of the plan is begging for some funding, but it ain't there.
One of the changes that I think we're in the process of undergoing is maybe best represented by the 1990 election itself, when at the same time metropolitan area voters were adopting by fairly significant numbers ballot measure 5, the property tax limitation. They were supporting in extraordinary numbers, 83% I think was the average, the $100 million bond issue to construct light rail. Part of the message, I think there are some growth management things involved there, but part of the message as well is that we may have passed the day when we can go directly to voters and ask for the support of general government for the good of all. We may well have to look at targeting taxes for very specific purposes, and I think that is in part what's going on here.
Yes, question from the floor?
Don Kramer, City Club member. Bill, first of all, nice job on, I think, crystallizing what is a fairly major document, and those of you that haven't read it should get a copy of it and take a look at me, talk about where to do that. My question is, I'm a native Oregonian, I've gone to school here, I have 2 small children, and the discussion we're sort of talking about today and sort of the values that we identified in the study have sort of been in transition, but they've been around for almost the last 10 or 20 years. And I guess my question is, how do we get to the next plateau, or how do we get past this question? I know the legislature, you know, if you had the answer, everybody would be a lot happier and get on with life a little bit. But the question is, how do we take the knowledge that we have from the study and sort of move us on to the next step, take us to the next plateau, so we can talk about other issues about how we're going to fund our schools and how my kids can get an education. How do we create the jobs? How do we create livability?
I should mention, by the way, summaries of the study are going to be on the table in the back for the first 150 or so who get there. Well, I think this is a pretty good question, kind of the central piece, and my experience has been this, particularly when talking about education reform. It's getting increasingly difficult, and I see several educators here, Ben Schellenberg from North Clackamas and others. It is increasingly difficult to get educators to focus on education reform on the one hand, when on the other they're trying to keep the wolf from the door. Nevertheless, I don't think we can allow that to restrain our forward momentum. We just have to keep our hand on the throttle and keep moving forward to the greatest possible extent. It seems to me one of the reasons we did the value study was to help create some common dialogue about what was really important to people. There are lots of anecdotes. I have them, you have them, and certainly our elected leaders have them. And one of the things that we've done is to try and share this as widely and broadly as possible and dispel any notions or myths that may exist about it and use it as a vehicle to try and create some common understanding about what's important to people. Not that that will necessarily lead to immediate solutions about which there is a strong consensus. But frankly, until we deal, I think, with the education funding crisis, and it is rapidly approaching that, I think we're going to have a hard time getting people to focus on much of anything else in Oregon. And so it seems to me very important that we really get people focused on addressing this funding issue. Without that, it seems to me we're going to be talking about this for a long time to come, about all of these other issues. And it is school finance, after all, which got us to this point. Schools are the bulk of the property tax. My view is that Measure 5 was essentially a rebellion against high property taxes. So that is an issue that we're just simply going to have to deal with and deal with soon. The purpose of the value study in this instance, I think, is to help provide a common platform for that dialogue.
Yes, next question.
Diana Smiley, City Club member. Bill, when you spoke of education broadly, I'm wondering if you were including higher education and community college education in your remarks. I realize since Dave Frohnmeyer spoke largely about higher education last week, you may not have felt the need to cover those implications quite as heavily. But could you say a little bit about the value survey specific to attitudes around higher education and the need for higher education reform?
Higher education was included in some elements of the study, and certainly on the list of 24 government services on the scaled comparison technique that I described earlier. Primary and secondary education was in second position. Higher education was in ninth position. This is on the basis of the statewide information. And I believe that community colleges were about in 11th position, which is interesting. My view when I look at this long list of government services and the manner in which people responded is that it's a little like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you look at the list, that's kind of the reaction you get. The services which are broadest, touch the most number of people, tend to be at the top of the list, and so on. Having said that, higher education was still well above the halfway point. And if you look at some of the reactions about the changing nature of work, high school education, wages for those with high school education will fall, et cetera, I think you can imply for that at least that people are set up to understand the importance of post-high school education. I would also have to say, though, that the fact of that doesn't just bolt off the pages of this particular study. I did the entire presentation for all of the university presidents, the state system of higher education, and when we got to this point, there was as you can imagine, a bit of a pause, and Miles Brand, who's the president of the University of Oregon, said to me, or said to the group, he said, well, gee, maybe it is that people don't see us, meaning higher education, in this work education continuum, to which I say amen. I think he's right on the money, and I don't want to be overly critical, but I think that the state system in particular ought to be thinking about their relevance in this new world that we're rapidly approaching. And frankly, I don't see a lot of that happening right now. I think it's important. To your other point about reform and change, we focused principally, not exclusively, but principally on K through 12, simply because this dialogue, this debate is well underway. I should say we intend to repeat this in about 4 years so that we'll be able to measure change over that period of time. We'll probably do some initial follow-up work even yet this summer.
Yes.
Jane Goldhammer, City Club member. I think most of us in the middle class see education as a major article of faith. But what disturbs me is that there are probably as many people as there ever were who are educationally disadvantaged or disinclined or both. And the talk of the new scenario in which more education will be required for employment suggests probably an increasing polarity of haves and have-nots, with fewer and fewer menial jobs paying more than minimum wage, and as many people as ever needing that kind of job. Do you know of any addressing of this problem that is being done?
It's a very good question. Again, I think that the policy framework for the problem that you describe is virtually in place. To address this in a serious way, though, obviously requires more resources than we presently see out on the horizon, and I think it's one of the issues at risk. Part of the 3565, for example, envisioned learning centers, and the whole notion was we've got a dropout rate that varies widely from one place to the next, but in any place is unacceptably high, and it may well be that we're attempting to fit round pegs into square holes. And so let's look at alternative learning centers. Some districts have done that very effectively. Others have yet to do that. But it's a concept that I fear is clearly hostage to this question of resources. Again, and I don't want to lay too much at the feet of the education reform movement that is afoot in this state. I think, though, that the very fact that there are virtually no family wage jobs available for people without skills is going to cause more people to focus on education where they might not have. The people that I spoke of earlier who I went to school with didn't need to. It wasn't really that important, nor was it emphasized necessarily in the community. And I think that is a fact that will change.
We've reached the end of the line on our questioners and the end of our time today. Bill, I want to thank you very much for bringing the provocative results of this study to the City Club members and your own thoughtful comments on it. Thank you very much. Again, there are copies of the report available as you leave. We're adjourned.